Now we move on to the next philosopher, which is St. Anselm of Canterbury. St. Anselm of Canterbury, year 1033 to 1109. Okay, St. Anselm of Canterbury followed St. Augustine, basically. Or at least we can say that St. Augustine was a strong influence in St. Anselm of Canterbury in a few aspects. First one, traducionism. Traducionism is something that St. Augustine considered as an hypothesis on how God created souls. According to St. Augustine, and according to this hypothesis, God created souls in Adam, so that's why all of us have original sin, and then through generation the soul was transmitted, etc. But at the same time, that soul is totally spiritual, and that soul is created by God, okay? So this is traducionism, brings up an explanation on how original sin is transmitted to everybody, but has some difficulties in how the soul is transmitted or created by God, etc. Of course, St. Augustine states that the soul is created by God, and he states that the soul is spiritual, but at the same time considers the possibility of this traducionism, this inheritance of the soul through natural generation. And well, that's something he explained, and this is something that St. Anselm of Canterbury considered as well. Traducionism as a way of explaining original sin, transmission of soul, etc. This is one of the points in which St. Anselm of Canterbury follows St. Augustine. Then, of course, in his conception of human person, there is a trace of St. Augustine's philosophy. For St. Anselm, there is a soul and there is a body which are united, totally united in the unity of a person. The soul is in all the parts of the body. The body is totally vivified by the soul in all of its parts, and they live together in a unity of a person. This is what St. Anselm of Canterbury states, following St. Augustine's view of the human person and Boëtius. So that's another trace of St. Augustine's philosophy in his philosophy. And third point, for St. Anselm of Canterbury, as for St. Augustine, every now and then it's difficult to draw a line between philosophy and theology in their writings. Okay, so both of them wrote, of course they are amazing philosophers, but sometimes in his writings you don't see this philosophical system perfectly differentiated from the theological one. Okay, so philosophy and theology go together. Why? Because, as we know very well, and as the first philosophers in the history of medieval philosophy, as we saw in this course, the first philosophers stated this principle. All this philosophy and theology together comes from this credo ut intellegam. I believe in order to understand better. So to speak, I believe I don't touch the faith, and with my intelligence I try to understand, and the fact that I believe, it helps me to understand, but I never touch, of course, the contents of faith. So that's why for these philosophers, it's difficult to draw a line between philosophy and theology. This is more or less the presentation to St. Anselm of Canterbury, which again is a good follower of St. Augustine. St. Anselm of Canterbury's most important contribution to the history of philosophy is the two arguments he gave us to prove God's existence. Okay? The first one is called a posteriori argument. A posteriori argument. A posteriori in Latin means you start here on the things you observe in nature, and little by little you come to conclusion about God's existence. Okay, so the fact that God exists comes last is the last step of your argument. So, as a matter of fact, St. Anselm starts in observing nature. So it's empirical observation of nature. Okay, that's the first step. He observes nature and he realizes that there are things better than others. Then he takes a step and he says, where there is a better, there must be a best. Where there is a better, there must be a best. Then he observes that in nature there are goodness and different degrees of goodness and wisdom and different degrees of wisdom. So Anselm says there is this goodness, then there is goodness better than the other one, then the goodness better than the other one, and so on. So because he thinks that there must be a best, he thinks that there must be here, absolute goodness. Goodness in an absolute way. Absolute goodness. And same with wisdom. There are wise creatures, there are wiser creatures than others. There is human beings which are smarter and wiser than other creatures. And he thinks that there must be wisdom itself. That is to say, absolute wisdom. Absolute wisdom, absolute goodness. Okay, so from these different degrees of goodness and wisdom in nature, from nature, and degrees of goodness and wisdom, he moves from there to God. Okay, absolute goodness, absolute wisdom, and here it's an inferior level of goodness and wisdom. What happens here, as we will see later, is he takes for granted as well that creatures here in this side receive being from God in this side. But he doesn't explain exactly how this jump takes place. Because we understand, that there is wisdom, there are wiser creatures than others, there are creatures which are better than others, but how that you jump from that to the absolute goodness and to the absolute wisdom. So there is a jump there which is not clear. Plus, there is an objection here. How can you be sure of the objectivity of your judgment when it comes to establish different degrees of wisdom and goodness? We'll talk about it later on in this class. And here is the second argument that Anselm of Canterbury gave us to prove God's existence. It is called ontological argument. And this is probably the second most important argument of God's existence in the Middle Ages. Probably the most important one is the one given by St. Thomas Aquinas. We will talk about it down the line in this course of History of Medieval Philosophy. But St. Anselm's argument about God's existence, entitled Ontological Argument of God's Existence, is probably the second most important one. And here's the thing. Let us read it in its own words. He says, quote, "God is that than which no greater can be thought, but that than which no greater can be thought must exist, not only mentally, in idea, but also extramentally. Therefore, God exists not only in idea, mentally, but also extramentally." Okay, that's the ontological argument by St. Anselm of Canterbury. I'm going to read it again. God is that than which no greater can be thought. But that than which no greater can be thought must exist, not only mentally, in idea, but also extramentally. Therefore, God exists, not only in idea, mentally, but also extramentally. Okay, so the thing is, the idea of God that I have in my mind is gonna be, God must be the best being ever. Okay, so, and I have that idea in my mind. All of us, common experience, as St. Augustine said. Most of people live with this assumption. There must be a God, a perfect being. Okay, so that perfect being, in order to be the best one, has to exist not only in my mind, but also extramentally. Because if it didn't exist extramentally, it wouldn't be the biggest, the greatest being that it could exist. And in my mind, there is the idea of a being which is the greatest. So if I have in my mind an idea about the greatest being ever, that greatest being must exist in reality, not only in my mind, also extramentally, because otherwise it wouldn't be the greatest. Okay, that's why God has to exist. That's the point. And now let us say something about the difficulties that these arguments present. Let us go back first to the a posteriori argument. A posteriori argument of God existence. This argument presents two problems. The first one is, how can you, St. Anselm of Canterbury, how can you make sure that there is objectivity in your judgment about the different degrees of goodness or wisdom in creatures? So how can you be sure of the objectivity of your judgment? Objectivity of judgment. Because, for what for me is a degree of wisdom, it might be different for other person, and so on. So the first difficulty of this a posteriori argument is, how can you be sure of the objectivity of your judgment in establishing those different degrees of wisdom and goodness? And the second one is, there is an assumption by St. Anselm of Canterbury, which is, he says that this absolute goodness and this absolute wisdom, which is God, transmits being to the other creatures. So the other creatures participate of the goodness and the wisdom of God, which is okay, but he doesn't explain how. Okay? And that's exactly the gaps and Thomas Aquinas will fill in down the line in his philosophy. So how the absolute wisdom or goodness transmits that quality or being. Okay, so a posteriori argument, two difficulties here. And for the ontological argument, the difficulty is just this must. Yeah, of course, God must exist, because everybody thinks of him, everybody assumes there must be a being there, which is perfect, etc. But there is a jump in the argument. Yeah, it is true that I think, in my mind, I have the idea of the perfect being, better than which nothing can be thought, okay? So, if that's perfect, that idea is perfect, it must exist in the reality, because otherwise it wouldn't be perfect. Well, there is a jump there, with this must, which is not clear, and this is something that St. Thomas Aquinas will explain better down the line in his arguments explaining the existence of God. So this is enough for us to study Anselm of Canterbury, but it's still very interesting because you see in his arguments that the philosophy he is doing is more developed than the previous authors.